Morning all, and welcome to one of the first sessions of the Communicate Conference 2020. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted that you're joining us for what I hope will be a really interesting, informative and lively discussion around a very topical theme of the green recovery. So this is a session where we'll be exploring building back better and building back greener. My name is Chris Venables. I'm head of politics at the environmental think tank Green Alliance, and I have the honoured job of guiding the discussion over the next 45 minutes with three esteemed and brilliant speakers on this topic. So I'll just kick off with a few bits of context. I don't think any of us thought in November 2020 that we would be indeed on an online panel talking about the issue of green recovery. And indeed, one of the things that we'll be exploring in this panel is what has changed this year and where are the kind of green shoots now. Obviously, I think lots of us are spending our time probably using that phrase and thinking about that phrase of green recovery. And I increasingly find myself at trying to get to the bottom of exactly what it means. So I'm delighted that we've got Guy, Ross and Izzy to help us explore that, to get up to speed with what's happening in government, with what's happening in the sector, and what people are thinking as well. So I'll just introduce our three speakers. So we've got Guy Horsington, who joins us from Her Majesty's Government, and he is Deputy Director for Environment Strategy and the 25-year Environment Plan, which lots of people know a lot about. Guy will no doubt talk about. Ross Kennerley, who is Southwest Regional Director for the Woodland Trust. So in the neck of the woods where we would all be in person if we're meeting in Bristol. And finally, Izzy Gornall, who is MD and founder of Seahorse Environmental and a kind of brilliant thinker and all around a great person to be engaged and speaking on these issues. So hopefully I've not bigged you up a bit too much, but I think it will be a fascinating discussion. And as I said, my role is to kind of steer us through and pull out some key themes and lessons from 2020. And as we look into 2021, which we know will be a really big year for the environment in the UK, not least because the UK is hosting the UN Climate Conference. We've got the kind of next big round of the Convention on Biological Diversity, and of course, in the big context of that is the kind of economic impacts of COVID-19 and how we, as a society, as a country, and as a world, start to kind of respond to that. I should also say that I will be looking at the chat. So I've got some questions that I'll be fielding to Guy, Izzy and Ross, but please do chat away. I'll be looking in there and I'll try and capture any interesting themes and make sure that if you've got questions or thoughts that you'd like to throw into the mix, then I will be on the lookout for those. But we're going to kick off with a presentation from Guy, who will give us a bit of an overview of the green recovery as Defra sees it. I'll then invite Izzy and Ross to kind of respond and to bring in their perspectives as well. But yeah, Guy, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Chris, and good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. I have some slides, which I hope Ellie is going to be able to share on the screen in the next couple of seconds. While that's happening, I'm just joining from Somerset, so I'm also in the southwest. So it's very nice to be here, and I'm beadily eyeing my the green light on my broadband connection. So fingers crossed it will work. Great. So if we can move to the next slide, Ellie, that would be great, and we can we'll make a start with the presentation. I wanted to begin by just acknowledging that the natural world is in a state of crisis. Obviously, at the moment, over 2020, we're thinking about the state of crisis, which varies with the global pandemic. But for a long time now, and this quote's from 1962, so you can see that the challenge is growing. And I chose this quote. I could have chosen a quote from any number of nature writers and pioneers. But the reason I chose this quote is that this refers to the significant power of the human species to alter the nature of the world. And while quite a bit of this presentation is going to be about what we've lost through our actions, I think it's really important to recognise, and that's clearly what we recognise, hopefully within government, which is that we also have the power to alter nature and to recover nature. And so that's why I chose that quote. And of course, here I am in a very nice village in Somerset, looking at the countryside. But it's incredibly important, I think, for all of us to remember, as I'm sure you do, that the veneer of nature that we see in the countryside, while wonderful, is increasingly paper thin. Whether it's wildlife loss, increasingly silent fields, polluted groundwater, a whole range of things that we are losing, and that is very much at the heart of the government's environmental strategy and the plan to build back greener. So if we move on to the next slide, that would be great. And so the state of the natural environment, whether people can see all of this, I'm not sure, but you can probably see from the graphs, from a whole area, from air quality through to priority species decline, farmland birds, the state of our SSSIs. The trend is not looking good. It's either getting worse or it's flat. That's true at the domestic level, it's true at the international level as well. Around 1 million species are facing extinction. We've lost 2/3 of our coastal wetlands. In the first 4 months of 2020, deforestation in the Amazon rainforest was about 50% higher than in the same period last year. And of course, hundreds of millions of people depend on nature in a way, perhaps we depend on it less in this country, but in other places of the world, whether it's fish for protein or whether it's earning your livelihood from the forests, which we're wiping out. This is a critical moment, and that's why we can't ignore it, and we have to take the actions. But I hope that we are taking and that we will continue to take. So let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so the political and economic context. The urgent scientific case is there. I think it's also good to acknowledge that the proportion of the public who are worried about the environment, climate change and pollution is reaching a record high. I think we're about 25% of people raised it as one of their top concerns in February 2020. That's one of the highest scores in the last 30 years. And of course, as it's not in the news as much as it would be, but we have left the EU, and leaving the EU gives us much more autonomy to set our own environmental policies in the future. That's exciting. It's also a bit daunting as well, especially for a department like Defra, which over the last 30, 40 years hasn't had that power, because so much of those decisions have been made with the UK obviously inputting within the environmental context. And the green recovery that we want from COVID-19 also sets that challenge. And the Conservative Party manifesto, over a series of manifestos now, has continued with that commitment to deliver the most ambitious environmental programme of any country on earth, and to aim to leave the environment in a better state than we inherited it. So if we move on to the next slide, something that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, which is the 25-year environment plan. I'll say a bit more about that in the next slide. Here I wanted to focus on the 10 goals. Those are our goals that we will seek to improve over the next 25 years. That's also going to be met with developing a set of metrics. There's no shortage of great nature writing in this country. Nature accounting isn't quite so good, and I'm really pleased that Defra is at the front end of across the world in setting indicators, collecting data, investing in our natural capital and ecosystems assessments, because that's absolutely critical in order for us to track progress. I've also recently joined this job from another role in Defra, where I was leading on the agriculture bill, which I'm pleased to say is now an Agriculture Act, having passed Parliament. That also sets in train a much more nature-friendly approach to farming, which will put put that right at the heart of how we manage land use. In our country, over 70% of the countryside is farmed, so we're very much a farmed country in that respect. So it's critical that we are able to take those new freedoms to ensure we have a more environmentally sustainable approach to farming. So if we move on to the next slide, that would be great. Okay, so 25-year environment plan launched in 2018. You probably know a fair bit about that, so I hope that in previous events we've talked about that. I think the two things to bring out there are that this is a plan for the whole of government. It's not just for Defra. Recently, the National Audit Office published a report, and they made that clear. That's important to us, clearly, because we want to make sure that the whole of government is aware of its obligations and responsibilities. And so that's important. And it's also important that this is the first time that a government has set out a plan over a really long period of time, a quarter of a century. That may not be a long term in respect of the environment, but it's certainly a long term in respect of how government looks and plans. And within those slides, there are a variety of things there that we've done, either from the policy and the legislative perspective, and I'll say a bit more about the Environment Bill, but also very punchy actions such as banning things, which governments don't tend to easily like banning things, but whether it's a trade in elephant ivory or it's a ban on the sale of the most polluting domestic fuels, a variety of actions there. And our focus for 2021 is to move on to the next stage of delivery when we've got a legal framework in place. So if we move to the next slide, hopefully I can just say a little bit more about the Environment Bill. Again, some of you may be familiar with it, like quite a bit of Defra legislation. It's sort of coming back for a second time. Obviously, there's been a fair amount of political and parliamentary turbulence over the last few years, but the Environment Bill is now back in Parliament. It's picking up progress. It's in committee stage in the House of Commons, and it's absolutely critical for defining the framework that we will have in law in order to ensure that this government and future governments are held to account for the progress that they need to make. It's a big bill. There's a lot in there. Some of that's up on the slide. As a couple of things I'd draw out, the setting or the requirement for us to set legally binding long-term targets in a number of areas which relate to the goals of a 25-year environment plan. I think that's going to be really significant. A lot of interest in that and a lot of progress that we need to make over the next few years on that. And also setting up the Office of the Environmental Protection as well, a means of holding government to account on its progress, investigating complaints, enforcing breaches of environmental law. Really, really significant and important. And all of that is set by our internationally recognised environmental principles as well. And I give a shout out to my Agriculture Act as well, which is also critical, not just for the money, but is currently used for land use subsidies through the Common Agricultural Policy, but also how we intend to use that in the future. So I'll keep rattling through because I have no idea where I am. I didn't spot the time, so I will continue to make some progress and not overrun my 10 minutes. So we'll move on to the next slide. Okay, great. Okay, so it's a variety of things here where the government's investing in the policies and the ambitions for the environmental plan. Yesterday we had the spending review. Some of this was in the spending review. It was generally, I think, if you look across a number of departments, it was a reasonable settlement for Defra. I mean, any department was always going to want more money, but these are incredibly challenging times. And actually, there were some really quite positive areas there where we doubled down on the funding that we've got. So I invite you to have a look at that. I'll say a little bit more in the next slide, I think, about, if we can move on to the next slide. Great. So last week, the Prime Minister published a 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution. I'd like just to sort of draw out a few points of that which relate to nature. So one of those points was about nature, and clearly the other points in the plan are absolutely critical to the delivery of our wider environmental agenda. But there was an additional £40 million to invest in the Green Recovery Challenge Fund. That's a fund that has been set up in response to the COVID-19 crisis and there's very significant challenges which the green sector is facing. And so it's really good that we've been able to double the amount of money which is going into that. As well as in the 10-point plan, we also focused on more beautiful and iconic landscapes, so more national parks, areas of natural beauty, and then also really exciting 10 landscape recovery projects. So this is linked to the Environmental Land Management Scheme, which I say is going to be the successor to the Common Agricultural Policy. Areas where we can, really create wilder landscapes, restore peatlands, woodlands, and hope to see more of that biodiversity, which comes when you let sort of nature take more reign in the farmed landscape. So many of you will be familiar with a whole range of rewilding projects, and this is an ability for us to take that to the next level. Okay, so the next slide is a synthesis for you to read, probably at your leisure, on the full 10 points in the plan. So you can obviously see that all of those things, I hope, are mutually supportive of a green recovery and a green agenda. The government really putting its energy behind a number of initiatives, innovation, technology, nuclear, decarbonising particular industries, a whole range of things there which show the Prime Minister and the government's commitment to that. So I'm going to try and move on to the next slide. We'll try and draw this to a close because I think I'm probably running over time now. Chris is nodding, so I probably am. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to say is that government can do so much. I mean, legislation is important, of course it is. It can change lives, but and funding is important. But we can only really do this if we deliver with other people. So it's a great opportunity to be talking to you today about the role that you have in this. So society, business, government, all absolutely critical. I mean, I might just draw out a few examples of that from the Environment Bill. So we need to work with developers when it comes to biodiversity net gain to make sure that when we're making planning and housing decisions, we're restoring biodiversity. So we need to work with producers when it comes to the extended producer responsibility. We need to work with retailers when it comes to the deposit return scheme, a whole range of parts of business and the third sector that need to be part of this. And our Council for Sustainable Business is an excellent bridge between government and business to maintain that momentum, and also to support what is going to be a really exciting year in 2021 with the CBD and the COP26. We want to use that as being an opportunity to showcase what we're doing in this country, as well as obviously learning from what's happening around the world. A variety of other things there. Some of you will be familiar with. But I think I will probably just end. I started off with a quote from 1962, so I'm going to end with a quote from 2020, which is the Prime Minister quote, just saying that this is the time. If we don't take the opportunity that there is now to build a green recovery from the horrors of this year, and to support a skilled workforce of people for future generations, we aren't going to achieve the cleaner, greener and more beautiful country that we want. And on that note, I will stop. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Guy. That was a really impressive overview of everything the government is doing, and I think clearly there's a kind of strong level of a kind of leadership from the top on this agenda. Just to pick up on a few of the bits that have started to appear on the chat, I think we won't be able to answer all of those questions, but it seems that the theme is how we put some kind of real tests on what a green recovery kind of really is, and to give some substance to the words and that we're all using, really. So in kind of responding for this moment, but I'll turn to Ross to offer his reflections from Woodland Trust and the kind of landowner and nature NGO on this moment, and please do keep commenting in the chat. It's useful to see.
Hi, can you hear me, Chris, at all? I'm still here.
Yeah. Are you there, Ross? You can. Oh, we lost Ross. Well, such is the way. Such is the way. And indeed, as with COVID-19, we must respond to these moments and seek to look at things that are in front of us and what we can learn. So, with that in mind, I will turn to Izzy, who has a huge amount of experience in kind of engaging with the environmental agenda from a political and comms perspective. So Izzy, I guess, yeah, your reflections on this moment and on what's coming through in the chat around yeah, kind of substance and giving it some real meaning.
Okay, thank you so much, Chris, and thank you, Guy, for your excellent presentation. It's so nice to actually see it all there, and to actually trying to condense all of your work into 10 minutes is actually very impressive. I think actually at this stage we should all take a step back and even think back 5 years ago, and to reflect that actually what an amazing time we have had over the last month in terms of the environmental agenda being raised really high in the political sphere. I mean, even the PM's 10-point plan last week was really a defining moment. Now, we can certainly pull it apart, but I just think that should be noted cross party as well. And I think that it's great that it is actually the Prime Minister who was really leading on this. And look at the announcement as well around the Marine Reserve, around our overseas territories as well, having the Prime Minister facing a video on that and actually fronting it and saying how important it is that we protect our marine environment too. It's not just around sort of financial issues. So yes, what is there to kind of think about? Well, let's focus down in terms of the Environment Bill, which is coming back for report stage we think the week of the 7th of December, and the real things for us to actually focus on going forwards. There are still quite a lot of gaps in there, sadly. When we look at the Office of Environmental Protection, which is going to be the governing body to hold the government to account, we still don't yet have anything in terms of multi-year funding for it. It's not really going to be that independent, and it's currently being watered down. So that very much needs to be a focus going forward. I think we also need to see legally binding targets and interim targets as well, because who knows what any next administration will actually do on this. But look, in terms of the way that we have to move forward, the most important thing is to think about money, because at the moment, having just had this spending review, and we know that we are currently in the worst economic time for the last 300 years, which is just extraordinary. We all, in terms of the environment sector, want a lot of funding for everything that we need to actually achieve. And right now, nature restoration, which is going to be a huge part of everything we do to try and get to net zero, is sort of really at the back of the list in terms of, where the government are trying to invest in clean tech and others, which is great, but actually nature restoration is going to be a huge thing. So what I would say to all of those campaigners watching and everyone who is lobbying and trying to communicate on this, you must be able to link all of the finances and focus all of your efforts on the Treasury now. They are open and willing to listen. They're being very responsive in terms of the fact that they've got to meet these net zero targets, but you now need to be able to make the argument and work on them, because they hold the purse strings on this. So I'm sorry, that's a very sort of like wrap up.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful, and a really helpful reminder that that it's easy to forget that 3 or 4 or 5 years ago we'd be really fighting to kind of get airtime on this agenda, and that really has changed, and we're in a good space on that. Welcome back, Ross.
Yes, can you hear me now?
We can hear you. So on that note, we invite you to share your reflections from the Woodland Trust on the green recovery, and to respond to the government's proposals and Izzy's reflections on current politics.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chris, and thanks, Guy and Izzy. So I represent the Woodland Trust. Hopefully, can speak a little bit broader for the environmental charities as well. And I think we just, as has been reflected, what extraordinary times. You know, we came into yesterday morning with a climate emergency and environment emergency, and we've now got an economic emergency as well. So these feel like really pivotal times, and that we now really need to grasp, as Izzy said, the opportunities that the government are offering. Now, we need to call that to account, we need to bring that into action, but we do need to reflect that this is a clear opportunity. Climate, ecology, environment are now in the language, and we really do need to make note of that. So I think we welcome the direction of travel. You know, we welcome the language that's being used and the proposals coming forward, but we do need to scrutinise and challenge how that comes into action. And that is not easy. There needs to be a sympathy for our government, for our civil service and the structures to bring this forward. So there needs to be some tolerance here and some collaboration. And what we do need to do, though, is to make sure that alongside the built infrastructure that comes from this Build Back Greener, that we fully infrastructure. Not an add-on, not a second thought, but there at the outset, part of the planning from day one. We really need, that's a mindset change that hasn't been there for some time. We really need that to come forward. So in a way, from the environmental sector, the message is now through to the public. You know, the public will accept there's a climate emergency, will accept there's a nature emergency. I think we really need to move rapidly to support the solutions. We need to keep pushing that people do understand the issues and the reasons for doing it. But we really need to change the debate into what can now be done. So I'm just going to make 3 quick suggestions about what we might build. The first is consensus. So we need to build that common ground where we come to the table with our shared aims. We need to hold on to our red lines and those things that are most important to us. But we really need to be able to get to the table together here. We need to stand in the shoes of others. We need to understand the sectors. The second thing I think we need to build is the story, and that does need to be about hope and optimism. We need to take solutions and we need to say, what do those mean for communities and individuals and families? You know, what is a nature-rich, low-carbon community that I'm going to live in 10 years' time? I need to picture that. And I think the third thing we need to build is an integrated approach to land planning. Because at the moment we have 4, 5, 6 government departments with different views around land, an attempt to bring them together, and all due, you know, the government has talked about integrated approaches here, but we have food, energy, development, infrastructure, all competing on the same space without a clear approach. And I think if we could come together and integrate our approaches around land, we would unlock a lot of the solutions. So that's it from me, Chris, for the moment. Cheers.
Thanks, Ross. That's again a really kind of helpful, clear set of thoughts and reflections around this moment, and I think that one around consensus is particularly important. But just to pick up on your second point, and I think just remembering the conference we're at and the theme of how to communicate, I wonder if you think that the events of this year have kind of changed how the public are engaging with this agenda, and if there's any lessons that we can learn from how people have kind of, I mean, it's a cliche to say kind of re-engage with nature, but obviously it has been a huge year for kind of public attitudes, both kind of XR, youth strikes, and, as we say, that kind of now real political priority. So yeah, I'm interested to hear any reflections on Ross, how your members, or Izzy, how you're seeing kind of media narratives change, and what hope there is in that for a green recovery.
Well, if I pick up, I mean, I think we see it as a charity, as an environmental charity. You know, the intent of the members to want to see action, and those charities to both push for it but also collaborate in it, is really strong. And those memberships around cause in the charitable sector, I think, have sustained. You know, people have not lessened. And as you said, Chris, this year we have, for those of us who've had the privilege to be closer to nature, we have realised, and it's been so well reflected, the importance of nature to us individually, our families, our communities. So it does shift the debate. There is an open door there against which I think we should now push and seek to step through. So yes, we do need to keep calling this out, but I think we now need to step beyond it and say, really, what can we do to take Guy's point about the veneer of nature? You know, we really need to build that much, much more deep into, you know, our future planning.
Izzy, do you want to come in on that point?
Yeah, I think it's also just to sort of add and say that in terms of stories and narrative, I mean, there really is nothing more important, because you have to be able to not just communicate to the media and also to government, but actually so much of the change that we have seen is because of the general public and them actually wanting this, right? That's in terms of every shift you see from retailers and others, it is because customers are now demanding cleaner, greener products. And everything that they are seeing is that actually, if you were to label something and say, actually, this is having a better impact on the environment and it doesn't cost you any more, which is becoming more and more common, that is what consumers want to buy, right? This is the shift now, which is fantastic. And, you know, if you take something like sea grass as an example, and the narrative around there about how much carbon it can store, what it does for local biodiversity in the sea, and, you know, there are some amazing stories coming out of green restoration, you know, which is exactly what we should be promoting. On the other side of it, you've got what's currently happening with peat restoration, and quite frankly, the destruction of peat, which is it's outrageous, really. And the fact is that government have tried to do like general phase out of using peat, and it's not worked. And, you know, everything you read from the National Trust on this is quite extraordinary in terms of the fact that we've heard a lot of narrative around it, and yet nothing's actually been done. So there are plenty of examples, and just reading through the chat here, people saying, but how can the government say one thing and then do another? This is something that continuously happens. It's not going to stop happening until actually we can get, as Ross said, this collaboration of others. And we've got to see more and more teams coming together to join up and have one approach with really clear arguments as to why we have to push certain ways and get the public involved, because, you know, that is where we'll see the real shift.
Thanks, Izzy, and I think that is a really good summary in a way of where I think at least I've felt the narrative and the context move, which is how do we create stories that really allow people to step into a kind of a place of really being engaged in the agenda, and also being able to navigate these quite complex policy questions, and even as someone who kind of works this stuff every day, it's quite hard. You know, Guy's slides were a really good example of the breadth of the agenda, and we talk about the environment, but we're really talking about everything. And so there's just this massive challenge to how, you know, like how we create those stories. But I feel quite hopeful hearing that as you say, finding those seeds of excitement, whether it's seagrass or Ross, as you say, you know, what does a place really look like, and how can I describe it and, you know, get people excited by it. But Guy, I'll bring you back in here, because obviously there's been a lot there around how to match, you know, I guess particularly on the nature side. I think on the climate side, the government is really investing. But I guess particularly on the nature side, how we start to kind of push and what scope you see there for like how you would respond to those kind of niggles around, you know, great words and yes, 10-point plan, yes, Build Back Greener, but things like peat, or things like the roads program, or other things that environmentalists kind of might look at. Sure. I realise that's a kind of impossible situation, and you're not representing number 10, but
I'll try and helicopter over it in different parts. But I mean, thank you to everybody for their comments on the chat as well. Obviously, I'm able to respond to all of them, but really helpful, and it's great. Also, there's good debate going on within the chat as well, because I think that's really useful. I mean, I just wanted to come back on a couple of points. I mean, I think absolutely the point about stories and narrative is really important, and we've seen, in this year, for many people have had much more access to nature because they've been at home in rural areas, experiencing the countryside and nature in a way that they haven't had time to before because they're commuting or whatever. That's a very specific set of people. And there are other people who are living within cities who have been, through lockdowns and etc., really been deprived, even of the most basic opportunities to engage with nature. And so I do think that 2020 is going to provide us with a real context to set those stories, and that's incredibly important for government to hear that and to be part of that as well, because that's how we respond to public concerns. That's the nature of politics in many ways. So that's one point I'd make there. I mean, I do, to come back to the point about the opportunity that we have now. I think that there is a real debate going on. So for example, how do we manage our land in an environmentally sustainable way? I doubt people here have been following all the debates on the agriculture bill or the environment bill, but there were really interesting debates about the role of agroecology, about the soil. We saw about talking about food standards and the environmental equality and animal welfare, a whole range of issues which are really coming out as part of the fact that we are now engaging with this in a different way, because we're engaged, because we have more say over what these what we can do, and I think that is also really powerful as well. Now, to come back to the point about well, this is all fine words, and where's the money, etc. Of course, it's very complex, and I saw in the chat people were comparing the amount that we're spending as to how much people are spending on other things as well. Of course, we understand that, and as a department, we're always going to be banging the drum for as much investment as possible. But I don't think we should lose sight of the fact that you can only win that argument if you make the case for it, and then you act across government to achieve that. And so there are going to be a whole range of sources of funding, and it's really important that we try and see the big picture of that as well, and make sure that those things are working together. And there's always a danger in government that you try and do one thing in one area of government, then you do something else, some other, and it sort of mitigates the impact. So that's a real obligation on us, and we can only do that with the sector and the support of others to make sure that we're not missing the big prize here. And the big prize here is to restore and recover. Sadly, the situation is that we're trying to protect what we've got left, but we need to recover and restore what we've lost, and that makes it all the more ambitious and challenging.
Thanks, Guy. Ross, were you poised to say something there or not?
Well, I suppose it comes back to that point about how do you get collaboration both within government, Guy, but also how do you get citizens, communities properly engaging with that, so that we do get this comprehensive solution, because I think that's where people become dissatisfied, that they see small wins through campaigns but losing the larger wins across the piece. So I suppose if there was something from this session from an NGO perspective or environmental perspective, how best can we both challenge and support government to get this right and join up the dots here on what really is a pivotal point for us to get this right? Yeah.
Guy, did you want to?
Well, just very briefly, I mean, absolutely. And so, for example, things like our local recovery system, which we are, strategies which we are developing, are exactly that point, which is about trying to get the local community, with local authorities and others, to define for themselves what their priorities will be. And that, we've seen that can work quite well when it comes to local planning decisions, and we need to make sure that that is absolutely embedded when it comes to making decisions about, nature recovery networks, corridors, all of that. We need to connect people better with what's happening within their own local communities, and then they will not only engage, hopefully, but also take part as volunteers in making that happen.
Thanks, Guy. Izzy.
Yeah, I just want to sort of say I'm sort of conscious of the time, and reading everything in the chat, it really seems that everyone is very nature-based, solutions focused, which I love. And I just feel like I should just point out some really big political moments that everyone should be focusing on for the next year. So the first one, we've got the PM hosting his big UN climate summit on the 12th of next month. We're going to get the big NDC announcement as to their sort of carbon goal ahead of COP next year. And so as soon as we have that, it's going to be hugely ambitious. And, you know, that is where you should come in and respond to that and say, you know what, here are some local projects that can be scaled up, and if we scaled these up, this is the impact that we can have, and, you know, to try to help them achieve that. We've then obviously got the Convention on Biological Diversity next year, COP15. You know, lobby governments to make them more ambitious. You know, I feel like it's the big COP that's being ignored next year because the UK is hosting COP26. The other big moment is in June next year. We're going to have the government's major net zero strategies, how they actually aim to get all of this done. Lobby to get all of your plans in there. And as I said, make them economic, make them scalable, and really, really push hard on that. So those are my sort of pointers, but I'm sort of around to talk about that.
Thanks, Izzy. That's really helpful, and indeed, it feels like we're just getting started, and I wish there was a bit more time. But yeah, we've actually only got a few minutes left. So, but I think it would be helpful to look forward in the kind of closing few minutes and think about, as you say, Izzy, 2021, the big year, both with the CBD COP, the UNFCCC COP, the local elections. I throw into the mix as well. It's going to be such a big year. So I guess, yeah. What gives you, what's your advice for everyone on the call for engaging in the green recovery in 2021, and what gives you hope in that, I think, as well, you know, because I think as we've discussed, those stories of hope and engagement are really important. You kind of answered, but but I'll still give you a chance. So let's start with Russ.
So I think it's an enormously hopeful point. We've got to grasp this opportunity. There's so many cards on the table at the moment. It's chaotic for sure, but we need to go with it. So definitely the time is now. And I think at the kickoff of this as a Communicate conference, I think my challenge or my comments would be, you know, how stories, and I just pick up a comment on the chat here, particularly, how do we tell positive stories for those who are not engaged, who are isolated and aren't part of this discussion? How do we paint that positive picture that climate and environment is part of the solution, not part of the problem?
Thanks, Ross. Guy.
So the things that I'm looking forward to in 2021, I'm a school governor, and our primary school is really getting much more engaged in nature. And I think if you can do that, that's great. So I encourage people, you know, to see children, particularly as being a kind of way for future generations to engage. So that's great. And then no one's really mentioned it, and it's probably not my space to, but I'll take a risk. What's happening on the other side of the Atlantic, I think, is also pretty important and valuable. So I'll leave it there, but I guess you know what I mean.
Yeah, no, indeed. Things are looking a little brighter than they were on the 2nd of November for our agenda. And Izzy, any final words of hope and wisdom?
I was actually also going to mention Biden, because it has just completely changed everything, and I feel like now nations will really start to compete with each other again, and here we go to the big competition on the global stage, which is actually hugely important. And look, we have the Environment Bill. It is amazing. It's going to put the 25-year plan into law. So, you know, let's really focus on that. We've got to get our own house in order first. So even though we've got these massive targets next year, do not forget that the next like 4 months is going to be focused on the environment bill. So do not take your feet off the pedal on that one. And I suppose my very final point is just to see all the amazing polling about how much the public cares, and we have to take faith from that and support to kind of keep going.
Thanks, Izzy. I've done quite well here. We're only a minute over. So thanks everyone for coming along. I really wish we could now go and have coffee and chat about all of that. But I would encourage you to really engage in the Hop-In platform. And thank you so much to Guy, Izzy and Ross for their contributions and discussion. And thank you to everyone in the chat as well. It's really great actually following that, and a really nice part of being able to do this stuff online. So yeah, thanks so much. Enjoy the rest of your day. Get stuck in with all the other sessions, and thanks.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you all. Thank you.